deep past in familiar terms. Pale skin, light hair, features that seem to flow naturally into the modern population. Textbooks, museum reconstructions, even television documentaries have quietly reinforced the idea that Europe has always looked more or less the same, just less advanced, less urban, less technological. This assumption feels intuitive. If today's Europeans are mostly light-skinned, then surely their ancestors must have been as well. The story appears neat, continuous, and reassuring. But this belief rests more on repetition than on evidence. It was formed long before scientists had any way to look directly into the biology of prehistoric people. It survived because for generations there was nothing strong enough to challenge it. Only recently has a new kind of evidence begun to ask an uncomfortable question. What if the first Europeans did not look the way we have always imagined? For a long time, any suggestion that early Europeans might have looked fundamentally different was treated with caution, even discomfort. Without written records or living witnesses, appearance was reconstructed indirectly through art, analogy, and modern familiarity. Skin color, in particular, was assumed rather than examined. It seemed too unstable, too culturally charged to revise with confidence. Ancient DNA changed that equation, but not immediately. When the first genetic data from Stone Age skeletons became available, many researchers approached it carefully, even skeptically. The samples were fragmented, the methods were new. Contamination was a constant concern, and the implications were unsettling. If these genetic signals were correct, they contradicted a picture that had gone largely unquestioned. At first, the findings were treated as anomalies, isolated cases that might not represent a broader population. Perhaps these individuals were exceptions. Perhaps the data would smooth out as more samples appeared. The idea that Europe's earliest inhabitants were dark-skinned, in some cases with light-colored eyes, felt counterintuitive, even implausible. But as genetic evidence accumulated across different regions and time periods, it began to form a pattern rather than an outlier. What had once seemed like a speculative possibility started to demand a more serious look, one that history had never been equipped to offer before. The prevailing explanation tried to contain the disruption. Early Europeans, the argument went, may have been darker skinned simply because they had not yet adapted. They were transitional figures, passing through, soon replaced or transformed as agriculture spread and populations mixed. In this view, skin color change was rapid, almost automatic, and the broader story remained intact. This interpretation was comforting because it preserved the old narrative. It suggested that appearance followed a straight line toward the present. Dark skin in ancient Europe became a footnote rather than a defining feature. But the genetic evidence does not support that framing. The DNA does not show a quick transition or a narrow window of difference. Instead, it reveals long periods during which dark skin persisted across multiple regions of Europe, even as cultures changed and technologies advanced. These were not isolated individuals lagging behind evolution. They were populations, stable over thousands of years. More importantly, the data separates traits that were once assumed to travel together. Light eye color appears early. Light skin does not. The combination challenges the idea that adaptation followed a single, predictable path driven only by latitude or sunlight. It suggests a far more complex process, shaped by diet, mobility, and delayed selective pressures. What collapses here is not just a detail about pigmentation, but a broader assumption that the deep past of Europe already resembled its present. The genetic record points instead to a continent that looked unfamiliar for much longer than history ever acknowledged. To understand why this unfamiliar appearance persisted, it helps to step back and look at Europe not as a finished destination, but as a long, shifting landscape of movement and adaptation. After the last ice age began to retreat, small groups of hunter-gatherers spread gradually across the continent. They followed animals, coastlines, and river systems, not borders or climates we would recognize today. These early populations lived by fishing, hunting, and foraging, often near water. Their diets were rich in animal protein and, crucially, in vitamin D from fish and game. In this context, there was little evolutionary pressure for lighter skin, even at northern latitudes. Survival did not yet depend on agriculture or limited food sources. Mobility, not settlement, defined life. As thousands of years passed, cultures changed without immediate biological transformation. Tools became more refined. Social networks expanded. Long-distance contact connected regions that had once been isolated. Yet the genetic signals tied to skin pigmentation remained remarkably consistent. The real turning point came much later, with the slow spread of farming into Europe from the southeast. Agriculture altered diet, reduced vitamin D intake, and tied populations more firmly to place. Only then did selective pressures begin to favor lighter skin on a broad scale. The shift was neither sudden nor universal, but gradual, unfolding over millennia rather than generations. Seen in this light, the appearance of Europe's earliest inhabitants was not a temporary anomaly. It was the norm for most of the continent's prehistory, shaped by ways of life that no longer exist, but once defined what it meant to be European at the very beginning. The strength of this reinterpretation lies not in a single discovery, but in how multiple lines of scientific evidence converge. Ancient DNA, extracted from bones and teeth thousands of years old, allows researchers to identify specific genetic variants linked to pigmentation. These markers are not guesses or visual reconstructions. They are measurable sequences associated in modern populations with skin and eye color. Again and again, samples from Mesolithic and early Neolithic Europe show the same pattern. Genes linked to light eye color appear relatively early. Genes strongly associated with light skin, however, are absent or rare for much longer. This contrast is not inferred from one region or one burial, but observed across sites in Western, Central, and Northern Europe. Isotope analysis adds another layer of context. By examining chemical signatures in bones, scientists can reconstruct ancient diets. Many early Europeans consumed large amounts of fish and wild game, supporting the idea that vitamin D deficiency was not yet a selective force. This dietary evidence aligns closely with the genetic timeline, reinforcing why lighter skin offered no immediate advantage. Radiocarbon dating anchors these findings in time, confirming that dark skin persisted well after humans had adapted to cold climates and long winters. Archaeology fills in the human side of the story, tools, settlements, and trade networks showing continuity rather than disruption. Taken together, these methods do not point to a speculative reinterpretation, but to a consistent framework. Genetics reveals biological traits, chemistry explains environmental context, and archaeology confirms long-term stability. The result is not a dramatic overturning of history, but a careful adjustment, one that becomes difficult to ignore as the evidence accumulates. What needs to be reconsidered is not simply the appearance of Europe's earliest inhabitants, but the assumptions that shaped how their history was told. For a long time, physical traits were projected backward from the present, filling gaps where evidence was missing. The past was made familiar because familiarity felt more credible than uncertainty. This older narrative persisted because it was simple. It required no distinction between culture and biology. Once established, it became self-reinforcing, repeated in illustrations, museum displays, and educational materials until it felt self-evident. The genetic record introduces friction into that comfort. It does not claim a single moment of transformation or a definitive endpoint. Instead, it shows that what we now think of as European appearance emerged slowly, unevenly, and relatively late. Skin color, eye color, diet, and lifestyle did not move in lockstep. Reframing this history does not erase modern identities or replace one certainty with another. It simply narrows the distance between evidence and interpretation. By separating what we assumed from what can actually be traced, the story of early Europe becomes less predictable, but far more accurate. History, as it turns out, is rarely a fixed picture. It is closer to a working draft, revised as new methods allow us to see what was once invisible. Ancient DNA does not rewrite Europe's past so much as it sharpens it, bringing neglected details into focus without closing the story. What emerges is not a contradiction, but a reminder. The people who lived in Europe thousands of years ago were not unfinished versions of the present. They were complete populations, adapted to their own conditions, carrying traits that made sense in their world, not ours.